Welcome to the next segment in this module. In this segment, we're going to talk about joining tables. And so there's kind of a couple different ways that we can do this. But the primary way that you should do this, and the easiest way that you should do this, is through relationships. And so we've looked at relationships before, creating relationships between tables, creating that one-to-many relationship. And that's really the easiest way to join our tables when we're trying to query something. And so the reason why we would want to do that is there are going to be times when we want to return data, we want to return records from more than one table. And so in order to do that, we need to join the tables. And so if we already have that relationship set up in place, we're going to be able to do that. So we can create the relationships between our tables within the relationship window in Access. And so by doing that, when we create our query, when we're in the query design view, we'll already see those tables joined. And so that's why it's easier to kind of set up that relationship beforehand. But if that relationship isn't set up, or if we need to query some data where there isn't a relationship there, we can join them through the query design view. In the upper pane of the query design view, where we have our list of tables and attributes, right there we can create a join between tables, and it looks very similar to a relationship. So if those relationships don't already exist, we can do that in query design view, and we'll take a look at that here in just a second. So whether it's through a relationship we've already created or through the joining inside of the query design view, we're going to have that one-to-many relationship. And so that one part of the relationship is always going to be the primary key from that table. And so the primary key is what uniquely identifies each record within that table. And so, you know, a lot of tables will have a column, an attribute that already does it, that uniquely does that, like client ID and employee ID and things like that. But there are going to be times when you don't have a column that does that. For instance, if you look at the client table, if you remove the client ID, then you don't have any way of uniquely identifying each record, meaning that you could have a client with the same name, right? That's maybe two different people, but they have the same name, so it doesn't uniquely identify each record. And so in a situation like that, you can create what we call a surrogate key, and that's just basically creating a new field with the auto number function. And so what that does is just going to automatically assign a number to each record. And so, you know, by default it's going to start at 1 and increment by 1, but you can change those. You can have it start at whatever number you want and then increment by 10 or whatever number you want in the case like that. But by having a field with an auto number feature that kind of increments each record automatically, well, now we have a field that's going to uniquely identify each record within that table, and so we can use that as our primary key. So the one side of the relationship is going to be the primary key for the table. The many side of the relationship, right, is going to be the same column from the primary key table, but it's going to be in the other table. And so that's what we refer to as the foreign key. So let's take a look at this. All right, so I'm in here. I'm going to come to and there it is. The relationship view. So this is going to bring up your relationship window here, and we can see the relationships that exist between all of these different tables. And so if we look at, let's say our clients here and projects, we can see on the clients the client side is the 1, and in the projects is the many, symbolized by the infinity symbol there. So we're using the client ID from both tables, and then the one side of the relationship is the client ID in the clients table, and so that is the one part of the relationship because it's the primary key from that table. And so we can see that indicated by the little key symbol next to client ID. And then on the other side of that relationship, we have our client ID, but we have the many side of the relationship. So that is essentially the foreign key inside of the projects table, which doesn't have a symbol for it, but when you write it in shorthand notation, it's going to be in italics to help you denote that it's the foreign key. So if I right click on this relationship and go to edit, here we can see it's a one-to-many relationship, as we know. We can see the column from each table. First one, we got clients with client ID. So the fully qualified column name is clients.clientID, right? And then for the projects table, it's going to be projects.clientID. But you'll notice that we have this check mark next to enforced referential integrity. And we talked a little bit about that before. And so what this does is just it prevents the creation of what we call orphan records. And so what an orphan record is if we look at this relationship between clients and projects, it allows what an orphan record would be as if we had a record inside of projects that doesn't have a client ID that exists in the clients table. So by enforcing referential integrity, it prevents us from being able to do that. It prevents us from being able to create a record in projects and give it a client ID that doesn't exist in the client's table, and that's done through that relationship that we've created. What referential integrity also does is it prevents us from deleting a record in the client table that still has a client ID associated with it in the projects table, right? So we're just kind of enforcing those rules so that we're not left with these records that have incomplete data in them, right? So referential integrity is a good thing because it could cause issues if we don't enforce it, right? If we, if we deleted a record from our clients table, if we deleted, a client, let's say, but we still have an open project for them, well, now we have no client associated with that project. So that doesn't make sense. So that's why referential integrity is important to enforce. So that's relationships. That's the relationship window there. So let's create a new query. So I'm going to throw up our clients table and our projects table. And so you can see right away, as soon as I put those two tables up there, that relationship that's already been created already shows up, right? So if I need to pull information from both of these tables, they're already joined together through that relationship. So let's do that. So I'm going to grab project ID from projects. I'm also going to grab the client ID from projects. So this is going to show me the project ID of all the projects that exist within the projects table. And then it's going to show me which client ID those projects belong to. So let's run this really quickly. And there it is. So project ID and then the client ID associated with that project. So project ID 20, it belongs to client ID 1. So those two columns were both from the same table, the projects table, right? But looking at this data, we have no idea who these clients are. We just have client ID number, 12, 1, whatever it is. We don't know who those clients actually are. So if we come back to our query design view, now if I add in client ID from the clients table, right? Now I can do that because the relationship already exists. The tables are already joined. So I have two fields from the projects table and then one field from the client table. So now I can run this. I can see all of the projects that exist, all the client IDs that are tied to those projects, and now I can also see the clients' names from the client table. So that is much more helpful. Okay, so now I want to add in the employees table. Good, so there's that table. And so you'll notice a couple different things about this table. One, there's no relationship created between employees and either of the other two tables, clients or projects. And the other thing you should notice is that there's no primary key for employees. So in order to create a relationship, if we want the one part of the relationship to be employees, then we're going to need to set a primary key for that, right? So if I go from employee ID to employee ID, there's my join properties. Now the fact that there's no primary key really only matters if we were trying to create a relationship. So because we're doing this right now in query design view, and we're just going to simply create a join between two tables just for this query, we don't need a primary key. If we wanted to create a permanent relationship between employees and projects, like employee ID, then we would need to set employee ID as a primary key so that we could create the one part of the relationship in employees and have it tied to the many part of the relationship in projects. But because we're just doing this for a query, right, we just simply need to join the tables together, and so we can do that in the same way that we create a relationship. Just drag each field to the corresponding field. But you'll notice that there isn't a one-to-many indicator, right? But if we right-click on it, we can still see our join properties, and then we can see those different options for our join properties. So we're going to leave only include rows where the join fields from both tables are equal, because we only want to see the ones that exist in in that field. So we don't want to list out all the records from the table. So we'll close that. So now if we add employee last name in there, now we have now we're querying data from 3 different tables, right? And because our join property is set to only include rows where the join fields from both tables are equal, we're only going to see the employee ID that's equal to the employee ID here, meaning we're only going to see the employee IDs that have projects assigned to them. And so from those, then we're going to pull the last name from the employees table for that corresponding ID. So let's run this and give it a go. Good. So there's all of our different projects indicated by the project ID, the client ID associated to each project, the client name associated to each client ID, and then the last name of the employee that's assigned to that project. So there's joining our tables Easiest way, again, creating that permanent relationship so that when we create our query, that join is already there. But if it doesn't exist, or if we only want to do it just for the query, we can do it in the method that I just showed you, where we do it through the query design view. So that's pretty great. Yeah, the other thing is, by doing this method here, we can't force referential integrity because we don't have that primary key set up. It's not a relationship. It's just a join from the tables to allow us to pull information from multiple tables. So, excellent. So, yep, talked about orphan records. That's the referential integrity. Yep, good. Yeah, and there's just a screenshot. I kind of elaborated a little bit more than that on my example. Sort orders. So we didn't really talk about sort orders, but we can sort our results from the query right in the grid view. We'll see the sort there, whether we want to do it ascending or descending, and we can include multiple sorts if we want to sort by, if the field that we're sorting by is going to have duplicates, right? Like for example, employee last name. If the employee is assigned to multiple projects, then sorting it by employee last name, is gonna there's going to be multiple records of that. So then we can also sort by one of the other fields as well, and we can keep going down with each different level of sorting. And so the precedence of the sorting is really important to how you set it up in the query design view. And it goes from left to right, meaning that if we have a sort over here, this is going to take precedence before this one over here. So if we want to sort by last name first, then we need to move this column to the far left, to the other side of project ID, so that that sort can be on the left hand side, so that it can take. So by doing that, and I'm kind of going off on a small little rabbit hole here, by doing that, if we wanted to sort by last name first, if we wanted that to take precedence, I would need to move it to the project ID. Let me do that so I can show you guys. So if I just drag this back over here, right, now I can delete it from this side if I want to, but by doing that, it's going to change the output of the data, right? So, for example, if I'm just going to clear all this sort area here, just so I can show you this, right? So by not showing this here and showing this here, right, now when I run this, now the employee last name is going to be the first thing that we see, right? And that's because in the grid view, the order that we have them in is the order that the results are going to be displayed in. So let's say, for instance, that we want to keep our employee last name all the way over here on the right, but we still want to sort by employee last name first. Well, we can keep that field in there in two different places. So we'll keep this one for ascending, but then I'm just going to uncheck the show button. So we're not going to see it. It's going to sort by it first, but we're not going to see it until this one over here. So we'll run this. And good, so we can see it is sorted by last name here, alphabetically, GHIJKL, blah, 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 right? But it's appearing now on the right-hand side. So we have that option too. So that's pretty fun. So, yeah, good. All about joining tables, relationships, and threw in some stuff about sorting too. So that's super helpful. So, good. I hope this was useful to you guys, and we'll see you next time.